Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by the Logitech G935 headset.
A Plague Tale: Innocence is a rather low-key title and perhaps a dark horse game for 2019. I myself only really heard of it due to DF viewers asking me about it on Twitter and in comments under our videos. And boy am I happy that you let me know about it. This Focus Home Interactive published game, a publisher responsible for another favorite of mine in Space Hulk, is created by Asobo Studio of Bordeaux, France, and is a unique experience, not just due to its setting in the French province, caught in the horror and tumult of the Black Death, but for its artistic stylings and technology. Just loading up the game on PC and casually scrolling through the menu after it loaded, I was sure I was looking at an Unreal Engine 4 title, both due to those available tweakable settings and due to the accomplished visual techniques on display in that opening chapter. But then I remembered there wasn't that usual Unreal Engine 4 intro vignette, and a quick Google search brought me to the fact that the game is indeed running on in-house technology. That is a rare and risky thing these days for a small studio. It's a huge undertaking to develop your own tools, which many projects in the past have proven so. From that famous Natural Selection 2 Spark engine from Unknown Worlds Entertainment, or Grinding Gear Games' proprietary technology for Path of Exile. But both of those games started development really before engines like Unity or Unreal Engine 4 really exploded onto the scene and became more versatile and usable. So it is really surprising to see such a unique engine at a time when similar games have been made on modern middleware before. I'm just impressed by that fact, and even more so that it is released on 5 separate platforms: Xbox One, Xbox One X, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4 Pro, and of course, my good old friend the PC. But the quantity is just one part of that equation. The quality actually here is the most interesting part, and it's why I'm talking about this game in the first place. Just loading up the first level, it's easy to understand why I thought this was an Unreal Engine 4 game. So many different effects and asset qualities are combining together here to produce this overall image. First, you have that obvious volumetric lighting, which, on PC especially, is of an especially high fidelity. On the ultra setting, extremely crisp rays of light and shadow fall across the landscape. And it doesn't just come from the sun, as it would appear to light the medium of fog itself, thus casting color and shadow from smaller point lights following lanterns or torches in the dark hollows of churches or from assailants at night. Interestingly, and somewhat rare to see, was how the volumetrics can also be colored and align with projection textures apparently, a perfect use case found here in this church, where stained glass windows appear to tint the color of the light transmitting through them and even hitting the floor. A static effect as far as I can see, but an attention to detail that is much appreciated and really often overlooked. Returning to that first scene as well, you should also be able to see just how dense this small area of the game actually looks. Thick with forest, trees, brush, undergrowth, and leaves and twigs littering that ground in a healthy fashion. As mentioned on the game's loading up, the game takes advantage of something called QUIXEL MEGASCANs, which is a library of photogrammetrically sourced and composited textures and materials. Asset creation and maintenance has been a huge sink of investment of research and development and financial resources since the start of this generation, as game worlds have become such of a high fidelity and much more complex. So Asobos being able to take advantage of a pre-existing library of textures and material surfaces really allowed the team to focus on modeling, placement, and lighting instead. The results of that integration are extremely consistently arted and detailed textures found throughout the environment, like the oft-found twigs and leaves on the ground. Which is interesting and something that reminds me a lot more of the art found in the Dark Souls games, or even something like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. Instead of utilizing parallax occlusion mapping or height map-based tessellation or the like, most of the ground detail in this game, or objects themselves, are just covered by normal maps and are just extremely detailed scattered meshes, avoiding the problem of visibly deforming terrain like we've seen in Anthem, or problems with oblique angles like we can see with parallax occlusion mapping in other titles. And since these are discrete meshes composed on top of one another or separately, they have a greater variation than just height alone. Simply put, the leaves are not just a texture, but they're a model over the ground, above the ground, and it really shows and it communicates that look of a carpet of leaves upon the forest floor. This carries over to many tiny details in the game, where lots of environmental detail is more than just a flat texture. It is in fact a three-dimensional object, like the floorboards of this house here, where each plank of wood is a separate polygonal asset and you can see through them onto the floor below. Of course, using such discrete models has its own production and performance considerations, but I appreciate this wholeheartedly as it is a unique approach, not really seen too often. Characters themselves also have a surprisingly and uniquely high fidelity for being a less than AAA gaming experience in terms of budget. In the soft glow of much of the game's direct lighting, it is easy to see how characters have an approximation of subsurface scattering on their skin, which causes less harsh fall-off of light and shadow interactions. Although this really only does carry over to direct lighting, as areas lit in other fashions tend to have skin looking a bit more papery. Much like the skin, the hair shader is also particularly good looking. It looks to use alpha to coverage cards that clean up over time with temporal anti-aliasing and show a particularly nice multicolored sheen that you really expect of hair, with a soft look around the edges. While the game uses particularly high resolution shadow maps on PC, these would still suffer under close inspection on characters. Hence how the game uses screen space self-shadowing, at least on the characters, and they apply seemingly from any light source. Like you can see here, screen space shadows on Amisa's necklace from a light source that actually doesn't even really cast real-time shadow maps. This kind of reminds me of Days Gone. These keep shadows on faces tight and detailed in close-up, but of course have typical screen space problems where they could disappear when obscured or when the shadow casting object just happens to fall out of view. Eyes are perhaps the only areas on faces that look less than stellar, like this still of Amisa's and Hugo's mother, where the mother's hair, the dress, the face are immaculately textured and have wonderful material work. Only the eyes really detract from the illusion that this is a human face, where they're missing that mottled tear recess you see in other games to help situate the eyeball more in the lids. Even with that minor blemish though, the characters are distinct, convincingly animated, and have wonderful voice acting, keeping the filmic feel intact. And there's also a healthy dose of bokeh depth of field found in cutscenes and actually used in the distance in gameplay. As much as I love that bokeh depth of field, especially on character close-ups where its creamy diffusion masks background details and keeping characters starkly in focus, I'm less of a fan of the all-encompassing chromatic aberration found across the entire image. It's really not just located to the edges of the screen, and it's not a function of depth of field as it would appear in a real lens. It's more of a pixel color shift, lacking sort of any blurred transition between the colors, like seen in other games such as Star Citizen. It's rather overbearing and not even really physically correct. It reminds me a bit of how it's used in Bloodborne, and it's basically just as intrusive here. Still though, it is at least possible, and thankfully so, to disable it on PC using an INI file tweak and setting fringe to 0, something that is sadly not possible on the console versions of the game. Of course, these nice photogrammetric assets and great looking character models would all be for naught should they be kept fully in the dark. Like many other slower paced games we've seen this generation, The Plague Tale Innocence relies heavily on baked indirect lighting, mixed with screen same band occlusion and shadow map cascades for its lighting. This smooth baked bounce lighting gives many interior shots in game, or those areas underneath overhangs or portcullises such as windows, proper lighting definition, and keeps those static objects in those scenes grounded in the world instead of sticking out. Sure, such lighting cannot move, but many scenes without it, such as this one here, would not at all look nearly as convincing or visually interesting. Like any static solution though, it has its fair share of problems, such as how dynamic objects look in comparison to static ones, as well as those problems of alignment and light leakage. Like here, how you can see lighting from the outdoors here in the corner of this hut, where would otherwise be in shadow. The light is leaking on through the geometry. But this baked lighting is a core reason why the game looks so good as it does, as physically based materials need a nice indirect lighting to really take on that life of their own and look the part. And since this game is heavily linear and not exactly Red Faction Guerrilla or anything, it's not exactly super important that the light can move. But not everything's static. The game does use screen space reflections, which do help quite a bit to ground dynamic objects in more across the world across surfaces of water. But the most interesting dynamism in this game is found in those vectors for disease that you encounter in the world itself. Yep, I'm talking about rats. According to interviews, the game will render up to 5,000 rats on screen at any one moment for gameplay scenes, and after many interactions with them, I can easily say this is definitely the case. They are really everywhere in some scenes, squirming and running about, scurrying away from the light of your torch, and swarming onto hapless characters, or even yourself if you're not careful. Technically, it's quite interesting, as they're not just cardboard cutouts like billboards, or simplistic geometry that moves in aggregate like a swarm of rats. Rather, they are actually individually animated rats with moving legs and tails and different animation states. Their exact technical makeup is a bit of a mystery without direct questioning, but at times the way they act when they move around the environment, kind of spilling over each other and falling with gravity and being repelled from light, it really reminds me of almost particle fluid simulations or something like vector fields driving the rat's movement away from light. It's particularly curious how they kind of boil away into a corner when you move against them with a torch. Not exactly biologically looking, but more like physics objects piling across each other. So A Plague Tale: Innocence manages to be a wonderful looking game, with individual notes rivaling really the best out there in the AAA gaming space, all on its own engine and with a smaller budget. But here I've been highlighting its visuals on the PC version on a very powerful and expensive PC. How is it on console? Well, for this video at least, I can say that the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro versions of the game are in their own right extremely attractive games. When putting one against the other in a direct side-by-side, resolution differences become apparent, with the Xbox One X having a noticeable edge over the PS4 Pro. Both look to output 4K images, but on camera cut or extremely fast movement, which the game doesn't have that much of honestly, the true internal resolution of the images after temporal shenanigans and anti-aliasing, well, it becomes obvious. In this case, it looks like the PS4 Pro is internally rendering at 1920 by 1080, and the Xbox One X looks to be internally rendering at 1440p. Given the game's heavy use of post-processing such as depth of field, lots of chromatic aberration, and a distinctly heavy accumulation temporal anti-aliasing, which seems to upscale as well, the difference in resolution is not that important actually between the versions. Those areas best helped by higher resolution such as foliage hair or distant material texture details, well, they make up a lot less of the game's content than its opaque geometry, shadowing, and lighting. The only thing that is really surprising is how quote-unquote low resolution this is on the elite consoles here, but if you look at that PC performance, well, it begins to make sense. To get a proper, stable GPU-related 60 FPS at ultra settings on an RTX 2080 Ti and Ryzen 1700X clocked at 3.9 GHz, I had to turn resolution scaling down to 80% in-game from 4K, thusly resolving 3072 by 1728. And even then, the GPU load was not exactly constant and can be completely saturated, especially on larger character close-ups where the expensive bokeh depth of field is taking up the screen. The game's performance profile reminds me a bit of Senua's Sacrifice before it, which also is extremely heavy on PC and has resolution sacrifices even on the elite consoles. Performance-wise, both the Xbox One X and PS4 Pro are basically a completely stable 30 FPS, regardless of what is happening on screen. The less than elite consoles here actually have the more interesting story. Here the PS4 base console runs the game at 1920 by 1080, which may surprise some of you in the audience as that is indeed the same number as the PS4 Pro. The Xbox One base console on the other hand runs at 1526 by 864. Other than the resolution though, they look extremely visually similar to the elite consoles, with the biggest visual differences in a side-by-side comparison being the extended draw distance range on the enhanced consoles, best seen by brush and vegetation drawing further into the distance, and also a slight uptick in shadow map resolution, Although curiously, PS4 Pro seems to be missing out on the increased draw distance here, which is rather disappointing. In a direct side-by-side, the greatest visual difference is really much like that found on the Elite consoles, where thinner transparent geometry such as hair or vegetation has a rougher look on the Xbox One, as it is cleaned up by a TAA from a lower base resolution. Much like there though, the resolution advantage is kind of lost with the game's extremely heavy post-processing. Although I must say there is a tipping point here of course, as the Xbox One version does look extremely soft, just not to the point of being utterly distracting given this game's filmic look. Performance though is the area of the greatest differentiation. Both the Xbox One and PS4 do spend a good amount of time at 30 FPS in game, but as soon as there's a lot of vegetation on screen, or when bokeh depth of fields for example comes up in some cutscenes, then they start to wobble and drop at times down into the middle 20s. Given the Xbox One's resolution deficiency here, it is actually pretty disappointing to see it perform the worst and look the worst. As I say that, PC performance is not exactly perfect. Sure, I was able to target a proper 60 FPS on the Ryzen 1700X, but the game did stutter a lot more than I would really like. It seems like an engine issue and not one actually stemming from CPU or memory performance. I have noticed this before in No Man's Sky back when it had an OpenGL client. There's this kind of problem in a game where it may stutter and produce a lower frame rate with output frames on the screen than the actual performance and frames being rendered out by your GPU. Your on-screen display FPS counter will not see it, but your brain does. Here in this scene for example, for some reason looking in the specific direction caused this problem to occur. It's almost like rendered frames are being eaten and prevented from being displayed. It does not happen all the time, much like the stutters, but it happens much more than I really find acceptable. Mid-range GPUs show expected scaling based upon our Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro performance. At ultra settings and at 1080p, the RX 580 and GTX 1060 come nowhere close to 60 FPS and spend much of the time in the 40s with drops even into the 30s. Putting down the graphics settings to a closer to console medium does help though, pushing those numbers up, with the RX 580 in this opening scene actually coming just a bit under 60 FPS, and the game still looking rather handsome in doing so. Oddly enough, this is a game where we have that rare moment where the GTX 1060 is superior to the RX 580 in a completely GPU limited scenario. Not something that happens so often, but perhaps this game's rendering is more suited for Nvidia hardware than AMD, which could also be an explanatory factor for consoles' performance and their comparable lower resolution. So there you have it. A Plague Tale: Innocence is a wonderful looking title that manages to impress even amongst peers in the AAA space that have a much larger budget. I'm still kind of floored how state-of-the-art the engine is from Asobo Studio. It's really amazing work. And perhaps this video is also your first contact with the game, and maybe you'll want to check it out too. Anyway, if you did happen to like this video and would like to see more smaller titles covered on this channel, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you would like to talk to me about this game and its rendering, well, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Featuring 2.4 GHz wireless, 50mm Pro G audio drivers, and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood, the G935 headset delivers the ultimate wireless audio solution for gamers, whether you're playing on PC, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch or mobile. Order yours today from Logitech G.